Ever since I was a kid, I've loved history. Whether it was kings and queens and battles, or just finding out about how so-called ordinary people lived their lives. But one thing always puzzled me. Where was I? And where were my friends? Where were the other blind people? Didn't we exist in the past? Or was it just that we'd never done anything worth recording? History, it seemed, was just about other people. And even when, as an adult, I got into radio, reporting on the lives of disabled people, everything of interest, it seemed, had only started in the 20th century. The battle for rights and equality, the invention of equipment to help us live fuller lives, appeared only to have happened yesterday. The truth, of course, is that for thousands of years, disabled people, while not being called that, were getting on with their lives, making a living, falling in love. Now, at last, historians are unearthing a wealth of new material. Letters, diaries, pamphlets, advertisements. It almost amounts to a new movement in historical studies. Chris Mounsey is one of the historians we'll be hearing from throughout this series.
I think it's been almost totally ignored up to now. I would say that disability history has, generally speaking, thought to have begun after the First World War, whereas we know there have always been disabled people. Those disabled people have voices that should be heard.
What is it about the history of disability that's attracted you?
Well, I've been an academic for the last 20 years and I have been partially sighted for the last 3 years. And I decided to find out about the history of people who were like me. And I'm an 18th century historian and I wanted to know what happened to people like me in the 18th century. As far as we're concerned, nowadays, we want to be treated as equal people. Part of that is to find out who we were and what our history has been.
Over the next 2 weeks, we'll be drawing on a wealth of recent research to explore this new history of disability. What we've been looking for are the first-hand experiences, the voices of those with physical disabilities. What I've got here is a letter from a man called Peg Barnes, who calls himself the only dwarf in Liverpool. And what an extraordinary voice it is. It was written in 1836, this letter, to try to get money from the authorities of the day. Difficult then as now. Writing to the Poor Law Guardians, this is his attempt to describe his life.
Peg Barnes, Liverpool, 3rd of March, 1836. Sirs, you know me. I am a dwarf, the only dwarf round these parts. And now a pearl comes over my eyes, and I cannot see to boot. So please, look kindly on a poor dwarf, and send me some trifle that I might get by.
This letter's one of many thousands which have been collected by Professor Stephen King of Leicester University.
These come from local record offices and from the National Archives, and they span the period between the sort of early 18th century and up to the 1890s when they cease. And so far I've collected 37,000 of them. But in these letters, what we get is the original voice of the person with a disability. We get the letters written exactly as they would have spoken, and we get their thoughts, we get their hopes, we get their dreams, we get their strategies, and we get fact. Fact about people's ordinary everyday lives.
Has this just been ignored up until now?
It's a big task. These letters are terribly badly written by people who are barely literate. For me, we have pigeonholed poor people in general and disabled people in particular. If we look at these lives and these letters, then you can begin to get a sense of real agency. These people were not powerless, they're not without a voice, and they're not without an audience.
Well, there's another letter here. This is it's a kind of begging letter. It's from Leeds, with a sense of humour, and it's come from William Jones.
William Jones, Leeds, 18th of November, 1903. Sirs, I am a dwarf, and you know what a problem this must be for a man such as myself, not more than 3 feet tall by all accounts. I have lost my job at the circus, and what is a dwarf to do in such a situation? I went to the Guardians, as is my right and duty, and they told me that I might do the work. But, sirs, what is a dwarf really to do? Were I in London, I might be good for work in the sewers, and of course there is the sweeping of the streets, or the theatre. But what about here, in this God-forsaken place, where the snow comes so deep that a self-respecting dwarf can't even walk along the street without drowning?
It's a great letter, and the point of it is, of course, that William knows he has to catch the attention and the understanding of the authorities so they get involved in his case. That poor, self-respecting dwarf is just one of the many characters I've come across in making this series. And over the next couple of weeks, we'll be hearing many other voices of people with disabilities, children, soldiers, successful entrepreneurs, even an MP. David Turner of Swansea University is the academic advisor to this series and the author of a new study of disability in the 18th century.
The 18th century is a fascinating period in the history of disability. On the one hand, you have a growing sort of move away, I think, from the idea of disability as a punishment for sin, and a move towards a growing medical understanding of disability. But at the same time, we have lots of other ideas that shape our perceptions of disability today being voiced in a variety of 18th century sources. They range from newspapers and periodicals to sermons, and you even find them in joke books. Not that we would find many 18th century jokes about disability funny today.
Two, passing the streets in a serious discourse, were interrupted by a dumb beggar. "Sirrah," says one, "don't you see we're busy? Therefore leave off your importunity, or I'll set you packing," and thereupon lifted his foot to kick him. "Oh, fie," said his friend. "Will you kick a dumb man?" "Is he dumb?" said the other. "Why did he not tell me so?"
A gentlewoman with an excellent-shaped body is approached by a gallant in the street. But he recoils when he sees her face. She is a monster of deformity. "Madam," he says, "had your face been answerable to your body, I should have took the boldness to have saluted you. But that matchless face of yours hath given a check to those inclinations." At which, turning her posterior, she replied, "Then, sir, you may kiss where you like best."
Well, you must judge for yourselves how funny they are, but what's striking here is that it's not just one-way mockery. Plenty of evidence of disabled people answering back. It was in the 18th century that the word disabled first began to be used in its modern sense. Other labels were much more common. Professor Judith Hawley of Royal Holloway, University of London.
There weren't many general terms. I suppose the most obvious ones would be lame or cripple, and that's more often used as an adjective rather than a crippled soldier or something like that. But there were some really quite juicy terms that imply a really robust culture of mockery. Hopping Giles or Mr. Hopkins was a name for a lame person. A knock-kneed person could be described as baker-kneed because he's grinding his knees together. An old woman might be described as a catamaran if she's walking on two sticks and so has these sort of outlying supports.
Would people use these labels about themselves?
Yes, they would. Cripple and lame were the ones that people most commonly apply to themselves. There are thousands of letters in which people are applying for help from the parish or the church, and they refer to themselves as a poor cripple or I have a lame hand. Or they'd say, I'm disabled from working.
Right, but would they use any of the juicier ones,
ones.
In a sense of self-mockery, if you like?
Yes, I think they would. You find especially street people, beggars, people living in this low-life world where nicknames are very, very common. They would use them of themselves.
Mm. So the nicknames were perhaps almost kind of a way of being included.
Yes, it's a way of having a kind of banter with people, a kind of negotiated discourse is a rather grand way of putting it, but kind of a knockabout sense of humour is a way of being accepted.
Yes, belittling yourself before somebody does it for you.
Exactly.
Was there any equivalent of political correctness at this period? You know, would anybody say, hang on, that's not a very nice term to use about somebody?
Let me think for 2 seconds. No.
Right. But robust, even insulting labels didn't necessarily mean that disabled people were treated with contempt in a society where illness and disability was so much more common. Stephen King.
The problem of thinking about disabled people in the 18th and 19th centuries is what is actually normal. Disability, depending on how widely you define it, but if we define it everything from a mental disability through to facial disfigurement, and we look at towns like Wigan, for instance, where I've been doing quite a lot of work, then around 60% of all people would have some form of disability.
That's an extraordinary figure, 60%.
60%. And if we go south to other places that I've been looking at, for instance, Box in Wiltshire, then it rises to 65%.
And what does that do to the notion of trying to help people who've got disabilities? Because it almost would mean you're helping everybody, or almost everybody.
Well, people simply in these places, particularly ordinary people, so I'm talking about poorer people here who comprise the majority of the population, these people have to simply cope. If one thinks of the Vicar of Wortham in Suffolk, just to give you one example, in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, he's physically drawing all of his parishioners, and he's recording their life stories. And these things have now been published, and you have this complete record of the whole village over 30 or 40 years. So you have everything from hair lip to burns and scalds, which make hands and arms dysfunctional, through to senility as we would now understand it. And then there's one particularly harrowing case of what we would now understand as elephantitis, where a woman gets growths on her leg and eventually after 25 years of suffering, it has to be amputated. But she has suffered, and they say, dragging her leg around for 25 years.
Does this not make disability more acceptable then than it is now?
Yes. Disability is not something to stigmatise.
Would you see embarrassment? Because that's what you really see nowadays. You see embarrassment. You see it's not necessarily cruelty. It's people finding it really difficult to deal with.
No, I don't see that. And I don't see it in a small Suffolk town like Wortham. And I don't see it in Wigan, because disability, the range of disability is so wide. And everyone is so at risk of being disabled at some point that it's normal.
What Stephen King is saying rather reinforces something I've always suspected, that attitudes to disability are not continually improving in a constant curve of historical progress. In many ways, past attitudes challenge our mealy-mouthed modern timidity